Okay, welcome to my bass jig fishing perspective. All right, situation is I've been bass fishing for, I don't know, probably 15 plus years. I'm 35 and I've been fishing since I was 3. It started with saltwater fishing. And on this particular stream, I want to talk about kind of my evolution in jig fishing. And I've listened and watched the pros, Bassmaster Elites, MLF. You were talking Kyle Welcher, Gerald Swindle, Brett Hite, Swindle, Van Dam, you name them, I've listened to them. And it's very interesting because there are pros that have different perspectives. I've even heard some pros go onto the Bassmaster tank and do their seminars. And they're like, look, I've been on circuit for over 10 years. And this is what I come up with in my jig. And when they come up with it, it's pretty much the same variant of any other jig, except typically now we're finding that the angle of the eye to the shaft is different for various applications, whether it be a casting jig, right, a punching jig, a skipping jig. Okay, you know where I'm going with that. Also, I've noticed that you have different tactics for how to set the hook, different rods, right? Different speeds. But my particular video is going to be about my understanding from the kayak fishing world. Because if you speak to the kayak anglers right now on what I would call the elite circuit or on the pro circuit or on the touring circuit, meaning the top 3 circuits and series, which are going to be Hobie, Bassmaster, and KBF, the guys that are on those circuits can appreciate there's a difference between the bass fishing world on a boat and the bass fishing world on a kayak, specifically relating to the ability to make effective hook sets, right? You watch on TV, those guys on the boats, I mean, they're pivoting from their hips every time and coming back with it. We don't have the luxury to pivot from our hips and make that wide range of motion. Hence, we have a different setup. And if you didn't know that, you should probably do some slight education and appreciate the differences. So when it comes to the jig, I started with this. I started number 1, background. I started pouring my own jigs probably 5 to 6 years ago. And I started developing actually about 5 years ago. But I started tying my own jigs a little bit before that. And I have a smelter. I pour them, pick out the hooks. And for those listening out there that are beginners and those that are listening to the advanced, I've listened to, Randy Blockett's. I've seen his configuration. I've seen their jigs. And this is the jig that I picked from Barlow's Bait and Tackle. And the take on my jig was the hook set and making sure that I had an effective hook set. Okay. So I went out and started doing a lot of jig fishing, realized that a jig really is just a hook with a weight with some type of either an angle, typically, whether it be 30, 60, or 45, and sometimes 90. And so the purpose, because I don't want, everybody knows we can get into this for hours and hours and hours, and we want to just talk about what makes things so different. And I found that there's a lot of videos, if we just take this from the line on this side all the way to this side on the hook. I just want to break it down like that when we analyze this. Okay, so into the analysis portion. Okay, a jig, number 1, is so good because, fish, they operate. Next spring, everyone, especially in the kayak world, is going to appreciate little bass fry that are going to populate around the surface. And they're in packs and they're in groups. And they get to developing their predator instincts. And eventually, as they mature, the 3 things or 4 things that entice them even until they die will be really 3 things. It will be either a nuisance. Is it a nuisance? Does it look easy? Or can it make me react? Right? Those are the 3 things that a fish is naturally going to gravitate to. And it doesn't matter what you throw, right? It could be a big swim bait, it could be a spinner bait, it could be a jig, crankbait, you name it. But at the end of the day, what determines whether or not that fish is going to appreciate this as a meal is, does it look easy? Is it a nuisance? And will it kick or scream type of thing, and how much will it kick or scream? And they develop this over a period of years as they start to eat, and they have that schooling instinct. So the reason why the jig works so well is because it has the ability to transition through all feeding windows, right? When you're looking at your feeding windows, like they have a hippocampus just like we have a hippocampus, and it has a circadian rhythm, and they have a feeding window that scientists can appreciate. When we're looking at our daylight hours, 1 hour to 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours to down to sundown in the evening. And they've actually put bass in tanks, and they've manipulated daylight hours, and their feeding windows began to change in order to accommodate to those daylight hours. So they are actually making circadian changes, right? And so as the day transitions, typically the bait and the commotion that you see in the morning transitions into slightly deeper water, and then into suspending, and then maybe around cover, and then around vegetation, right? And then they seek cover. And so there's a transition. It's an evolution. Every time you go fishing, it's an evolution, and it's all based on the conditions. So the jig, historically, because it has ability to start, you can swim it and continue it, or it has the ability to stop, and you can kill it and make it look easy, right? You can kill it in front of the fish and make it look easy, pop it and get it to react. So this is catering to those 3 things. This is why the jig historically has been good for all 4 seasons, okay? Because you can make it react, you can make them look like a nuisance, okay? And you can make it look like an easy meal when you're dragging it, okay? Now, here's the thing. Starting from what my perspective is after my tenure in the field is, number 1, the best knot. We're starting from the head here, okay? This is my Bacillus jig. This is particular is a 1/4 ounce. I'm going to talk about everything on this thing, and then we're going to talk about how to prevent snagging, how to manipulate guards, and kind of look at the science behind what happens when you are pitching it and you're pulling it up over cover like a branch. So let's start at the hook here. Pitson. First thing that comes to mind. Everyone's throwing polymer. Everyone's throwing, what is it? Improved clinch. But A. Martin, he passed from his throat cancer, and Randy Blockett talks about this particular tie. I started playing with it, and I found, and Jacob Wheeler, I found that your best knot is not a single line knot, but a double line knot. And I used to do a double improved clinch. So that's just basically running the line through, coming back, and now you're going to tie just like a regular knot, but you're using 2 strands of line. The Pitson is exceptional. That's my recommendation. Absolutely phenomenal knot. The reason being is because when you're jig fishing, my perspective on a jig is that a jig could look like this with a brush guard, or I could have a B jig like this, okay, without a brush guard. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit, or autofocus. Focus. Can't focus. Let's see. And I'm going to get more on my little, let's see if we can get it to focus. It might not. Okay, I'm just going to have to hold it like this, I guess. Yeah. All right. That's fine. So a jig could look like this. I mean, a jig could look like a Demiki rig. A jig could look like a crappie jig. when I say that I caught a certain amount of fish out there on Hobie or something like that, I'm saying I caught them jig fishing. I literally mean that, right? Like I was using a jig of some sort, meaning it could have had a brush guard or may not have had a brush guard. It could have had a skirt. Here's a bead jig with the skirt. Okay. But at the end of the day, I'm throwing a jig. I could throw a jig on a minnow and call it moping. I could throw a swim bait paddle tail on here, grass pig, and feed it for Alabama spot and Magnum spotted bass in Smith or Lanier. But when I say I was jig fishing, I was doing just that. I go up north and walleye fish with this jig head right here, throw a Berkeley Gulp minnow, a 3-inch Berkeley Gulp minnow, and I have you a feast in the evening. Okay. So when I say that I was jig fishing, I literally mean I was jig fishing. It didn't mean that all the time that I'm throwing it with the skirt. Okay. All right. So let's go back to this. Pitson, number one. All right, Pitson. Pitson, not double Pitson. Why? Again, it's very strong. But number two, it does have bulk, even though it'll have 3 endings. But even though you have 3 endings, yes, it will get just a little bit more vegetation and moss, angel hair and stuff on there, just a little bit. But the beauty behind it is a jig is going to be, when you catch a bass, when you always see, even in the YouTube channel and all the channels that you watch, them bass will come up and they'll have that jig right at their mouth. That's where all the grit is, right? That's where all that grit, that's where all that the teeth and the commotion goes. And the reason why I came to this conclusion with the jig, and you're going to find out later at the end about why it's important to use that, is because I'll take one of my homemade jigs like this, and I will use it and 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 use it until this paint is off and it's nothing but lead. And what I found is that those bass, they will crunch down on that. And when they crunch on it, either in the back, their retropharyngeal tonsils, or when you set that hook, what happens is you set that hook and they have their mouth closed and it scrapes against it. It scrapes against it. Okay. So what happens is if you have a single line knot, okay, and that knot gets abraded by fish, specifically spotted bass. Spotted bass are notorious for this because they could only fit it in such a certain section of their oral cavity because they average a certain size. You're not catching a bunch of different size bass a lot. You're typically around in Alabama and just riverine areas, you're going to catch the same size fish. And every time they try to hit it, they're going to get it in about the same configuration in their mouth. And every time you go to fight that same 14 to about 15 or 12 to about 15-inch fish, they're doing the same thing on that line. And they're digging down. Every time they're going against you, digging down, they're just abrading that particular knot and around this head. That's why I use a double Pitson. And that's why now I don't have any issues with losing too many fish when I have made the right line size choice. Okay. Number two, we're going to the head. The head is an indicator of its application, historically speaking. So we're talking punch jigs, right, and heavy cover jigs, or we're talking casting jigs, okay, which is another one. This is a custom jig that I made, okay, or just finesse jigs. It's the same thing, just like my original Basilisk jig is considered a finesse jig, okay. And the line tie comes in configurations of horizontal and vertical. Everyone has their own perspective on that. But if I'm going through grass and whatnot and veg, I prefer this vertical. Okay. So the head is up to you. I will say the fatter the head, honestly, that I'm not going to get too much into that because I can do just as well on a ball. Okay, and we'll get into that here in a second. Matt Allen, he's got a great perspective on this as well. I mean, everybody does, and it's all based off of their experience. But here's one of the most discussed portions of the jig is this weed guard. Everybody has their own way. here's what I've understood my perspective to be. And this is because I've taken the jig and I have a habit of taking one lure. This is the problem is I'll have one lure and I will fish that one thing for years, for years. So it's like I'm really, really good at a jig, no matter what variant, because that's all I've done. When people were throwing spinner baits and like catching fish and just scooping up and covering water, I was still jigging. And most of my big fish were still caught on small jigs and stuff like that. And I would always catch the bigger fish. Not always, but in a lot of instances, I would catch really big fish and catch up. And I was always throwing a jig of some sort. But what I learned is this weed guard here, because I'm coming from my background of making jigs, where I'm choosing from like an FG18, FG21, FG24, which are all different diameters and different thicknesses. If you're fishing a finesse jig like this, then you don't need a very thick weed guard. When you say thick, that means people are going to think, well, a heavy weed guard like a 3/4 to a 1 ounce will typically come with a heavy weed guard. This is more of like a FG24. And really, what happens with this weed guard is the most important thing that you could ever do to this weed guard is not cut it. That is not the most important thing. This is the most important thing that you could do right here. Okay. See this sandpaper? This is the most important thing you can do. And the second most important thing you can do is you could take and separate these, especially in the heavy cover jigs. Here's why. Whenever you're talking heavy cover jigs, or you're even talking about these finesse jigs, which typically have a more finesse wire-like hook, those hooks are very sharp. If you keep your weed guard tight like this, even if you did the what everyone does, which is cut that thing, because the point is so sharp, it sometimes will hit the weed guard, especially in the heavy cover 24, the FG24s. The diameter is so thick, and on very, very, very few occasions, it will stick into one of the fibers of the weed guard, and you'll miss that fish. This is in the FG24s, which is the heavy cover. In the thin ones like this, what's best to do is to take this and fan it out if you're worried about getting snagged. And we're going to talk about that whole piece, because the purpose of a weed guard is to prevent snagging, right? That's why it's called a weed guard, but really snagging of any variant, any media in the water, right? Rock, rock edge, bark, you name it, including obviously vegetation. What people don't understand is that in order to get through vegetation, the weed guard has to be at an angle. This is the beauty behind making your own jigs, because when you have a jig that has more surface area, let's just say you were a 3/8 or a half, for example, especially a half or even a 3/4, you have the ability to drill your own hole. This means that I can make that weed guard more or less than 45, which means I'm going to have a great entrance and egress through my vegetation, because now it's going to just go right over that weed guard, right? Whereas if I just bought it from the store, some of those weed guards might be sticking up way past 45, right? Between 45 and 90. And now when I go through grass, of course, I'm going to be snagging something, right? Right. And so the best thing for you to do, and we're going to talk about the weed guard and the whole snagging piece in a second. I want to get back to catching hundreds of, like dozens of fish on one of my bee jigs here. I've taken a shaky head, even a Berkley shaky head, with a Fusion 19 or one of my Basilisk jigs, and I fished it, even resharpening the hook. And I would notice that all the scrape marks were all on this, all on the head, all on the beginning right here, all on this weed guard, just all tore up from the grit on the fish, constantly rubbing on this, constantly rubbing. Well, you know what I noticed? I noticed that the more fish that I caught and the more beat up this weed guard was and the more abraded it was, guess what? The easier it was for me to get the hooks into the fish. The easier it was for me to get hook sets into the fish. And when you're looking at the physics, or like kind of, if you will, the science, when you're pulling this weed guard through the fish's mouth, it's the pressure that has to be applied in order for it to collapse. If every time you're pulling this through the fish's mouth, okay, imagine that the grit goes all the way around his mouth. Even the corners sometimes will have some extra grit, but you want to take this. This is one of the first things you can do to enhance your hookup ratio is to take your weed guard and not only just sand the front of it, like put your thumb and be careful not to abrade the hook point, but you can take this and start rubbing it like this until it's nice and abraded, until it feels rough. And what happens is that'll help that grit on that fish's mouth depress that effectively. And the other thing you want to do is make sure you turn it to the side like this and hit the sides. So if the fish's if the fish's mouth is oriented in a fashion where the jig becomes turned to the side, it also has the ability. When I've done this, now what happens is people don't realize why they're missing the fish. And everyone realizes that when fishing is really scrutinized to the hookup and how it's actually happening, it's true that it's about the angles, and that's why we're called anglers. And especially true with the jigs. I know the old jig fishermen are listening real hard, because when you're fishing a jig and you're always making sure you have contact with that jig, if that fish, when he grabs that thing and it runs, let's just say I'm going down the bank, right? And the bank is right here in front of me. And I'm casting. And all of a sudden this thing, and I'm facing this way, and this fish grabs this jig and he goes out like this at a 90 degrees to me. Most of the time, it doesn't matter what size jig that I'm using. Most of the time, because the fish is going to average 2 pounds, that's just what the average is going to be. It's going to be somewhere between 2 pounds and less. When I go to set that hook, I'm going to be able to hook that fish because I'm going to pull that fish when I set that hook, right? But the fact that he's angled this way, it's going to pull like this. When this is abraded, you're doing yourself a service and causing some abrasion along this weed guard as it pulls this way, okay? And that will increase your hookup ratio. Okay, so that's one thing. When you're talking weed guard for why you should clip it, why you should spread it, and the size of the weed guard, it all goes back to the size of the jig. Okay, all goes back to the size of the jig, going back to the fish, and then going back to the size of the jig. A lot of guys, they don't realize that if the fish is running towards you, and you should swing wherever that fish's head is. The problem is a lot of guys, they'll start using a rod that might not be stiff enough. And if that fish is running away from you, I'm still going down the bank, and that fish starts running away at a 45 and you go to set that hook, depending on the size of the fish, you're not going to get a good hook set. Because the average, again, is around 2 pounds or less, you might get the fish, right? But in a kayak, you're often drifting. In a kayak, you're going to lose just a little bit of power because you're going to move whenever you set that hook, and you're going to lose power in your energy due to either the wind or oftentimes because we're still moving towards our target and we like to cast while we're moving towards our target. That's going to be another reason. And if that fish is moving away from you and it's a big fish, he's got it very deep in his mouth. Okay, very deep in his mouth. So when you go to pull, that line has got an angle off of the corner of his mouth while it's deeply seated inside of his mouth. And oftentimes that jig isn't going to move enough. You're going to put more tension on this corner right here at the angle, the fulcrum, if you will, of where that line is, because he's got it snapped down in his mouth. And you're going to move that fish a lot. And all you did was move the fish. You didn't even move the jig. Pete Gluszek talks, if you want to follow up on that conversation, Pete Gluszek on Bass Resource, okay? Go listen to that. So, and it's very true. And it does, no one realizes it because the average, again, when you go fishing, how often are you catching that 7-8 pound fish? How often are you catching a bass's mouth that's this big, where this thing is literally nothing but a tic tac to that thing? Okay. Whereas when you're catching fish that are in that 2 pound range, they're not going to have it all the way back there like that, right? Because the distance between a 7 pound fish in the front of his jaw to the back of his oral pharynx is this long, whereas a 2 pound fish, the distance is this long, right? So you have all this line back in their oral pharynx, which comes to the angle, which comes to your ability to set that hook if you're in a kayak. And if that fish is going away from you, that angle is going to pull that fish, and it's not going to pull the jig very much. If it does, it's going to pull it against his cheek, right? So you pulling that fish, and a big 8 pounder like that, you didn't do anything. So what this does is abrading it affords you the quote unquote reserve parachute, if you will, by allowing some extra chance that the grit or the corner or something will abrade this. This is the one portion, okay, that you do not want to put any oil or water-based fish attractant on. This is a sacred area, this weed guard, okay? Again, this sandpaper, and you could file it out and push it out like this. That's fine. You can even leave it out if you want to. You don't have to cut it down. You can if you want to. But what really dictates whether or not you're going to get snagged, I'm going to show you that here in a second. Okay. The next thing, you'll get snagged more if you're fishing a heavier jig. I'm going to show you that. This piece here, this shaft, very important. I have something, I call it like a Mara rig or a Mara kit, and I'll show you how that works. It was on this bead jig earlier. But this hook, very important. Kyle Welcher talks about this. Who else talks about it? DC, Dustin Connell talks about this. It is super important on your jigs that when you're looking at, it doesn't matter what jig, if you look at the eye on your jig and you look at the hook point, the magic number, everyone talks about this as the hook, the bite, 1/2 inch, no less. I don't care what size jig it is. It could be 1 ounce all the way down to a 3/16 or less. I mean, you can't really get 1/2 inch from that, but especially a crappie jig, you'd be bending it out. But what I'm getting at is if you're bass fishing, okay, and you're fishing the typical 3/8 to 1/2 ounce, the distance, which is this hook point here to this eye, there's a distance here which you should be able to measure in inches, okay, from this point to this eye, that gap. There's an imaginary line where this hook point kept going and going and going and going until it met here, okay? This hook point kept going and going and it met here. It should, this distance right here should be a 1/2 an inch. Why? Well, when you trying to penetrate a fish's mouth, oftentimes you'll lose that jig if you're not maintaining the appropriate tightness on your rod, okay? And what happens is when you get these jigs and they have a standard hook point which kind of goes a little bit towards the eye, what happens is you'll set that hook and you'll just scrape and you will skin hook the roof of their mouth, okay? And the problem with that is you're not getting the barb in there. There's a reason why I chose personally the bead jigs and the bassless jigs. There's a specific hook that I always go with. It's not Gamakatsu. It's not that. But I'm looking for a very specific barb size, right? So I always choose the best barbs. There's a lot of hooks out there, but they all tote that they're great hooks with great material, you know, nano coated, anti-resist. All of that fancy stuff doesn't mean a thing to me unless I can appreciate the integrity and the quality of that barb. That barb is everything. And so what happens is this is important to take this, whatever tool you have, you got to be very, very careful. Okay, but I like to take it, go right behind the barb and cinch that down and make sure it does not degrade or dink the integrity of that barb. And you just want to open it up a little bit until you get about that 1/2 inch. And this is going to increase your hookup percentage and keep that fish pegged, because now you have a hook that actually penetrates into the fish and it doesn't scrape it or skin hook. Okay. Very, very important. This is going to have those jigs, especially on the medium to smaller fish, penetrating that upper jaw, penetrating that side jaw, penetrating that corner. That's going to be the difference. Okay. So that's the other thing. Let's talk about the whole weed guard and bigger jigs and kind of what I came up with, because I was fishing this in the beginning. This is what I was fishing. Coming up through the Virginia Kayak Trail, I would be throwing my custom jig and I would put a worm on the back of it. Okay. I'd put a worm on the back of this thing. And it worked great. However, I learned that your rod is extremely important to the ability of these things to work effectively. Okay. Also, I learned that it doesn't matter how well your weed guard is, okay, and how well you set it up, okay, it's going to get snagged. And I was kind of frustrated with this. I said, well, other than a Texas rig, other than a punch rig, right? How is it that I can get a jig in cover, in grass, without getting snagged? Okay. And a lot of people don't understand what's going on underwater. I have not seen not one time on any video has this ever been shown. And we're going to hash it out right now. Okay, we're going to hash it out right now. I don't know why it hasn't been shown, but long story short, I've got a bunch of jigs here, right? And we're going to look at its application. It doesn't have to be underwater. I got different types here. I've got heavy cover. I've got my personal. I've got a Berkley head in here. I've got a Strike King head in here. And then I've got my own personal cord from Barlow's in here. It's kind of like a poison tail. Okay. So when we're looking at finesse jigs, okay, finesse, that 1/4 ounce and less, and we're looking at how it is that they're getting snagged. Why are we losing our, $5 jigs or $3 or $4 jigs, right? Oh man, like I just tied that thing on, right? If you look at a jig, everyone ties it. Everyone ties that soft plastic kind of right here on the shaft, right? Right here, which is fine. Now on a finesse jigs are awesome. People love them because you really can't go wrong, right? You can't go wrong with its snagless ability. And that weed guard is stiff enough and the plastic is appropriate in width, oftentimes, mixed with the bulk of the skirt to get it pretty much over anything. I mean, I'm casting over a branch. I'm trying to pull it up over a branch. It doesn't even have the weight. This is a 3/16, I believe, or a 1/4, maybe a 3/16. It doesn't have a lot of weight to it. You're just kind of pulling it like this, and you'll notice every single time I do this, because this is kind of you standing from the boat, right? And it's going over that branch. Look how it's oriented every single time I pull it over that branch. Look how it's oriented. It orients laterally. You notice that? It orients laterally. Every time I pull it over this branch, you could see the weed guard, which means it's lateral, right? Okay. Very important that that's understood. Okay. So when you're throwing your expensive jigs, and look at this, the head's configuration. Notice this is a vertical. This is a vertical. It's made for weeds. Okay, it's a Strike King. I think it's a Bitsy Bug, maybe. There's a lot of different jigs here that are common. Let's check this one out. This is a 3/4. This is a 3/4 Berkley heavy cover. Now look at that head. You see how that head is flat? And now what do we have on the line tie? We have horizontal line tie. It's a horizontal line tie. Here's that cast. Here's the boat right over it, right? It's angled because you're pulling it from the boat or the kayak. But it's not really, it has a tendency to always ride either up or to ride down, right? It doesn't, you notice that it's not coming across. See how it's not coming across laterally? You see that? You see how it's either on his head or it's on his ass. It's either on the front, it's either prone or it's either supine, right? Okay, super important that you understand this. Why some things are going through and some things aren't. You see that? Now, I'll tell you right now, this thing is substantially more heavy. Way heavier, right? But, okay. But it's different, right? You can see that it's different. Okay. Let's take a look at this. This is without a trailer on it. I could put a trailer on it, but I just want to. So here's the same. This is a ball. Okay. And look at that. The ball snags. You see that? The ball is coming up. I'm casting it, and the ball likes to do that. You see that? Look at that. When I'm pulling it over. I'm going to show you how I got this skirt on there in a second. But look at that. It snags. And this is a 3/8 ball. It's a 3/8 ball head. See how that hook's point? That hook is pointing down, and it's going to snag it. Super important. So when people are talking about this, you're not seeing online just basic little scenarios like that. You see that there's an obvious difference. Look at that. Look how it wants to snag that. Look, it's literally, now it's stuck on my finger. You see that? Okay, very important. Very important. Let's check this one out. This is my go-to casting right now. It's a poison tail. Okay, I got it all fixed, doctored up in my style though. So check this out. We're casting, right? And it almost wants to do it downwards, but it's turning. Now, I'm going to explain to you what's going on with a jig underwater, and you're talking about, oh, I don't want it to snag. Okay. When I take this jig that we just said was snagging, and I have no trailer on it, right? No trailer. Okay. Let's come over here. And let's put a small trailer on it real quick. I've got a couple different setups for different applications, but I've been gravitating towards a particular style of jig for casting. So this conversation that I'm getting ready to go into is a conversation about jig and pig. Jig and pig. I should have some old guys and some old cats, some gurus' attention at this point. Okay? We're going to do the old-fashioned setup. Now, you have to realize that a lot of this conversation that we're talking about isn't going to stop the success of a jig in its natural form, because this is decades of success has been on its natural state. However, in a kayak, there does have to be some tweaking. Okay? There has to be some tweaking, because guys aren't prepared for the extra factors that come into play. Okay? Especially when you're at close proximity to a fish. Okay? Where a bass fisherman doesn't have always that same proximity. Okay? There's a lot of factors. So you'll notice that if I take, this is without a weed guard, right? So no weed guard here. So weed guard is super important. Even with the trailer on, you can see that this weed guard is super important. And without the weed guard, you would have this turning effect, especially with a 30-degree line tie or a 60. And you see how that hook is, look at that. Okay, so this is why a weed guard is important. Okay. So let's take, let's see here. Here we go. Okay. So on a finesse jig, you'll notice I'm going to do a quick insert about this hook point. A lot of guys will start losing their jigs when they go up in size. If you look at a line here and I hide the hook point behind this weed guard, is what I'm doing right now. I'm hiding it behind the weed guard. Okay. It doesn't take much for a deflection to the side, left or right, to get that hook point exposed. What happens with a jig and pig? And a lot of guys will start using the heavier jigs, especially in the winter. And a jig and pig will have a very wide, let's just take, for example, this, will have a very wide body. Okay. A very wide body. What that wide body does, okay, what a wide body does is it helps get that over your obstacle by pushing that jig to the side. It gives it a cushion for that jig to come up and over that obstacle. But there's a caveat to that. This is why a lot of guys might lose their fish. This is why Gerald Swindle says, with a jig, I'm not giving that fish any playing room. He's coming in that boat, and it's gonna be pouring rain out, and that 4-pounder is just gonna be, you know, he has that on one of his videos, right? He says he doesn't even know that he's been caught. He's in the live well, still jumping around, thinking I didn't even have a chance to start or even think about the fact that I was caught. So what happens with a jig, especially those heavier jigs, half and greater, and then you have someone that's not familiar with their rod setup, not familiar with the reel speed, even guys talking about Randy, even the other guys, right? Like the C-listers, I call them, the B and C listers on YouTube talking about a jig. Okay, these are the guys that are exclusively media producers on their fishing channels. Talk about if there was any particular setup that required me to have a faster reel, it would be for jig fishing, right? Because I want to be on those fish. Roland Martin, okay, talks about all of these things. These are all similar things. The only difference between jig fishermen that I found is that you have people like DC and Swindle. One's a slack liner and one is not. Edwin Evers versus, I believe, Swindle. Hackney. Hackney is a big one. But Hackney loves to let the fish swim with it. Gerald Swindle does not. There's a lot of guys that have different thoughts. And when you have that big jig and pig, because it's so wide, what happens is it allows that to come up and over those particular obstacles. But you also have fish, when they have their mouth around it and you go to pull, that jig and pig, because of its width, can get in the way of that hook set. it gives it just a little bit extra maneuverability of that hook point to dodge. Okay, especially when it lays to the side. This is why you'll see that when a fish grabs this, he's always grabbing it from the top. And then all the jig fishermen love to make sure that your jig has hooked the roof of their mouth, right? Always want that jig on the roof of their mouth. That means they came down on it. But there's times when even though that fish has made a great bite on it, he's swimming inappropriately against the appropriate angle or against your advantageous angle, right? So he's grabbed it, and instead of him coming any degree or variation in degree towards you, meaning like, 180, maybe 90 degrees to you, to zeros, to another 90, like in this like semicircle, if he's doing any degree away in any way, shape, or fashion, the problem with having that bigger chunk in there is that it causes a cushion to get to the side of their mouth. It's a cushion against their mouth. And so a lot of guys will lose fish on jig and pig if they're not cognizant, one, on the angle of the fish, two, the equipment setup, such as medium fast or even a heavy rod, okay, medium heavy. If they're not in tune with their gear ratio, which by the way doesn't mean anything, a gear ratio does not mean anything. Just because there's a stamp that says this thing is a 5-to-1 ratio or whatever ratio you can think of hypothetically does not mean that it's a fast reel. You need to be looking at your user manual and looking up the IPT, which is the inches per turn. And when I'm fishing that jig, it better be 33 or more. Period. 33 or more. Okay, just because it's a 7 to whatever ratio or 8 to whatever ratio, you need to be looking at the IPT, because I've seen brands out here that have ratios in the 6, 7s, and 8s, but their IPT, when I go to spool my line all the way to its full capacity, I'm checking its actual IPT, it's not getting what the manufacturer is saying it is unless that spool is at full capacity. And I found that it may not be meeting what it's labeled, right, or purported to be. So make sure you're spooled up all the way. But because I realized that a thicker and girthier trailer causes the ability to cushion, what I've come up with is something that's completely different, other than sanding down things, tuning the hook, making sure that I don't have a super thick skirt is another one. I don't put super duper thick skirts on. We'll talk about skirts immediately after this. Okay, I've come up with this. Okay, all this is, and this is all from me making my own jigs. This is a skirt collar, the same skirt collar that will go over your spinnerbait skirts or your jig skirts. Okay, it's the same little collar you can buy off eBay, Barlow's, you name it, any lure tackle shop making company. And then you have your medium-sized, or actually this is large or extra large bait keeper. It's a clip-on bait keeper. Okay, it's a clip-on bait keeper, like so. Super important. I call it a mirror rig. This is going to, in the purpose of this is to save on plastics. I don't know, there's probably, everyone doesn't really show that they keep up on my stuff, but I know that they keep up on my stuff, right? Especially my social media on pollution and recycling and stuff like this. Now we have PCBs all over the place, and PFAS and PFOS, and we have mercury in the Cahaba River, and nothing is untainted. So I transitioned to better plastics, specifically those plastics that have the Elastex, the Z-Man, the Lunker Hunt, and then the Nico brands. All are more expensive, but I find myself, I'll go a whole day throwing one jig, literally a whole 5-hour fishing trip, half day. I'll just throw one jig, one plastic. I'm not in my plastic, throwing plastic everywhere. I'm not buying extra plastic. And so this is what came to be, is how do I preserve and have some element of conservation when I'm going out and I'm busting fish's chops all at the same time. This is what I come up with. Okay. What you do is you take your jig, whatever it may be. Okay. You could take a jig head like this and you can clip it on there. You clip that thing on there. And the best thing to do is you take it and you just open it up with either some pliers or whatnot, and you just clip it through the hole and slide it in and then just pinch it a little bit. If you have Z-Man Elastex, you know how that's a pain in the ass to really set those things in. Jacob Wheeler talks about how he hates that. You're going to sit there and just whine and whine and whine. It feels like you're not going anywhere, but it just takes some work. You could just wind it on here, okay, whatever you're using as a trailer, okay, and you can put it directly onto your jig. The alternative, if you bought a jig, I made mine. If you bought a jig, okay, and the best thing is to get your hand-tied jig and make your own jigs. A lot of guys on circuit, including myself, we make our own jigs. I believe even I heard through a bird that Russ Snyder's even makes his own jigs. Okay, and so if I were making my own jigs, I hand tie them and I tie this clip in there. Okay, I tie this clip in there, and what you're going to get is something like this. This is a poison tail with all the adaptations that I said would set you up for an effective hook set and a solid landing. So now what I have is I have a clip that I clip onto the skirt collar. Okay, I clip that onto the skirt collar. Okay, and then what I did was I put my trailer on and I slipped it through. On the back end, I have another one that I put on there to keep me snagless if I want to, a little bit more snagless or more snag full. Why and how? Okay, so when you're pulling this, let's just say I tied on let me tie on a new one real quick. And this information is coming from someone who has chosen to just take a jig out while other people are throwing a spinner bait, or while other people are throwing a bladed jig, or while other people are throwing a crankbait, right? I'm out here just saying, you know what? I'm going to stick with this. I'm going to learn everything about it because I sucked at it. And now I'm going to figure out how this thing works on a kayak side, because there's things that I know that I found don't work all the time because we don't have the full range of motion. We have a PFD that's sticking out of our chest like this, right? That's another reason why you're not getting an effective hook set, and the list goes on. So with this, you'll see that as I'm pulling it, let's just say I'm pulling like this, immediately, what does it do? It does that typical lateral position, right? It does that lateral position, gets that hook away and moves. When you have this like this, instead of it being stationary down here, okay, same thing with this. Okay. You could do the same thing like this, for example. Let's just doctor it up. This is a finesse jig, so I'm not really worried about finesse jigs snagging that much, merely because it's just the weight of it doesn't give it the tendency to do that. The head doesn't sink down. It tends to be more buoyant horizontally, right? The reason why you're snagging in other jigs is because they're heavier at the head. But what this does is if you're fishing this, right, okay, and you put it in this configuration, what this does is allows that to control some of that hook point as it goes over certain objects and it gets to that lateral position, right? Imagine if I did it on this one. This is my onesie. This is a 1 ounce. So if I'm pulling it over, let me tie one to this too. Let's just tie one to this and get into this. Just for purposes of demonstration, we're going to put us a little clinch knot in there. Okay. So if I have this is a perfect example. I have a 1 ounce right here. This is a 1 ounce, right? And if I'm pulling this 1 ounce, look what that 1 ounce does. You see how that 1 ounce has a tendency to point down? See how it has look at the configuration. This is a perfect example. This is a 1 ounce rigged in standard fashion. Okay? Rigged in standard fashion. Do you see a weed guard? It's not lateral. It's not lateral. You see that? You see how I pull it over? It's not lateral. This is with the weed guard. This is standard configuration. Look at that. Right? Now 1 out of 10 pulls, it would be lateral. Just like fishing, right? Just like when we fish, we're not snagging all the time. Maybe 1 in like 50 casts. But this is your 1 in 50 right here. When you see that thing turn, okay? When you see it turn in like that, look at that. See how it's not lateral? You know how to fix that? You know how to fix that? And this is the same thing that happens with heavier jigs. Doesn't matter if it's poison. Doesn't matter if it's the casting style. Now watch this. See, when we turn this, it turns to the side. And when it doesn't, when it goes over the top, what's preventing the hook from actually penetrating when it does face that way is the trailer. The trailer is elevated towards the hook point. It creates a barrier and it controls that to the last point, to the very last point of the crest as it climbs. The thing that's saving that hook point from turning and rotating into the obstacle is that trailer at this point. At this point right here, what's saving that is the fact that you put your trailer in a higher position. And so that it gives it the surface area and the medium to rotate up and over. Okay, up and over. That's what's saving it. Okay. A heavy jig will take more work. Okay, a heavy jig will take more work. The other thing is if you're putting it through multiple branches and things like that, this thing will have a tendency, that's just one branch, but if there's multiple branches, you'll see that there's a tendency for this to just deviate the weed guard just a little bit left or right. And even though you may have brought it over one, it still has to go through multiple others. And this is why you would have a snag. Same with this. Okay. Whereas if I put it again, I've taken my trailer and I put it along this here. Now when I'm rotating it up and over, it's riding the side of this. See that? It's riding the side. The distance between where you secured it with the bait keeper, the spring, and this point right here is what's saving that from penetrating your obstacles. Okay. And so was born my jig. If you're looking at something like a poison tail, which is great, mind you, or you're looking at a traditional hook such as this one, this is still like a mustad. I think it's a mustad. The thing with this is if you know you're going to be in cover, this is how you should be throwing it. Okay? Because that's going to allow that to move away and over from some of those objects. This is so small when you set that hook, there's nothing that's going to impair that. But with a chunk that's wide, especially once you start getting wider than the head, that's where it becomes problematic. Also, that's why larger jigs have a tendency to be more difficult to catch the fish. Because when you have a large head like this, okay, and a fat body, if your head is very wide, those fish, when they spit it out, they're feeling that the head is there. They're going to spit that out with the accommodation of the head. And so they spit that out, and there goes the rest of everything. This is why I've been tinkering a lot with heavier jigs with smaller heads. And man, you will be amazed. I have a jig right now that no one even, it's been made, but no one even talks about it. I have not seen one video on it. I have a jig right now that has a 3/16 ounce head, but the weight is in the body, and it's a jig. And man, it is amazing. And it all comes down to the pressure on that head being pulled, okay, through that fish's mouth. You get far more hookups, and this is why the traditional weight is 3/8 to a half in that head configuration and that size. In most titanium or tungsten and lead accommodates a fish's mouth on the average fish. You will be amazed what a big fish, an 8, 9, 10, 11 pound fish, is capable of eating. I caught a 7-pounder or a 6-pounder on a 1 ounce, and a 1 ounce to a 6-pounder is like a little, cheese square to me and you. It's not much, but to the average fish, it's a lot to take into consideration. This brings me, before we get to the skirt and the other adaptations, to the conversation of why a jig is effective and why you're able to fish a variable amount of jig types and be successful. It goes back to the original conversation, which is a fish is going to eat based off of the fact, is it a nuisance? Does it look easy? And can it make me react? If you put those three things in the feeding window, you'll get bit, right? But that feeding window, we know, is a part of their circadian rhythm, okay? So based off of daylight, the vast majority of the fish will eat in those hours, okay? When people are talking about, well, what about night fishing? Or what about during the day when I'm busting them at like 1:30 and that wind kicks up? That is those ambient conditions, right? Kicking up, and you put it in their face and they're around their brothers and sisters, right? Something innately has triggered that, right? I personally believe it goes all right back to being fry, right back to being bass fry, right? When you're bass fry, you're traveling around with your pack. You initially start developing that reaction. You have a developing nervous system, cardiac system, respiratory system, muscle system is all developing. You're around your pack, and your pack are traveling in these little schools together, and you start to develop satiety, and pretty soon you're looking at what's out there. And the way your counterparts and your brothers and sisters react is, if something is coming close or I see something, we all do that. And that is a developing pattern, right? They're getting an appreciation of their environment at all times. They're developing lateral line, and they develop the reaction, okay? They develop the nuisance, and they develop the the nuisance, the reaction, and the ease, right? The ease. Does it look easy? Meaning they're going to develop an understanding of, does this thing kick or scream? Okay. And that's why I'll transition, and a lot of guys will transition from those power fishing tactics in the morning, okay, because they're eating, they're in full swing, they're trying to get that meal that lasts. Everything that's big in their lateral lines are often very stimulated in the morning, because you have bait balls, you have bluegill packs, you got tadpoles, which is something no one really talks about, which I believe is a really big factor that comes into play in the spring through the summer, is the bullfrog and the adolescent tadpoles. And so the crustaceans, obviously, and then all the other bugs, the rodents, and the birds, right? So when you're looking at why a jig is effective in the finesse form, and everyone's saying, well, I catch more fish on a smaller jig, right? I catch more fish, but I still can catch big fish on a finesse jig, right? And the thing is that's so true, because the average fish is not going to be eating something that's big, right? They do eat big fish. We've all seen those fish that are at least just an inch short of them, but somehow they manage to get it in their stomach, right? And we've seen, and that's kind of an exaggeration, but they are eating like fish at least a third of their size sometimes, right? Like especially the gizzard shad and herring and stuff like that. Okay. But as you downsize throughout that morning transition, they'll start picking up and snacking, right? On something that is not going to kick or scream, right? Something that the three things that I always consider your best bet to understanding is, does it make them feel comfortable? Is it secure? Does it kick or scream? When you're throwing big jigs, yeah, they get the big bites, but they're not going to get the small fish unless it's in that window of time that makes them feel secure and comfortable, and they can handle kicking and screaming. That's just part of their satiety. That's their satiation telling them that I can handle that earlier in the morning or closer to the evening. But in the afternoon, I'm digesting, I'm chilling out. When I see something a little bit larger, I realize that larger things are going to have a tendency to kick or scream. So how do I force that bite? Nuisance, make it look easy, or make it react. That's how you get these fish to bite something that you want. But historically speaking, when you're looking at the water column, they're not going to want something all the time after they've chased from sunrise something huge, unless there's a specific reason for that. It could be endogenous hormonal readiness, such as the spring, such as the fall. But when things stabilize, you have to, just like the day, just like you're transitioning through the day, you have to transition through the season and understand that. So this is why the finesse jig historically has been great. Just like why the shaky head, if I take this off right now, okay, I'll go right back to having this. Okay, I could take the skirt off, I could take the grub off, and now I have my B jig ready to go, and I can throw a shaky head on it. And now I'm ready to literally catch anything and everything in that water hole. But a shaky head could be turned right back into a jig, a 1/4 ounce if I wanted to, and I could start pumping it into a swim jig in the morning. Okay, next morning or in the evening or something. So this is why a big jig likes this compared to this. Okay, big jig meaning a little bit heavier, bigger trailer. Okay, may not be appealing to most fish. Okay, because most fish are not 4+ pounds. This is why you're smaller. Ned rig, same thing, right? Ned rig would appeal to the average to smaller fish. Hence, you get more bites. Hence, if you know you're in an MLF, you'd be fishing with something that appeals to the vast majority of the fish. Something that does not kick or scream. If I were looking in the water column and I was comparing things just as a human being, when people say, yeah, I like craws with big flippy flappies on it, that's what, gets me bit. And then they say, in the wintertime, I like it when it's nice and slow. The fact of the matter is, you're transitioning to something that's going to kick or scream. Again, it goes back to, does the meal look easy? Does it react? Is it a nuisance? That's essentially what we're targeting every time we go out to fish. And if we do it in the right window, during the right circumstances and the ambient conditions, we'll get the bite, right? So this is why your finesse should always be your go-to. Okay, back to your trailer. If you're using this technique, my recommendation is you could also Texas rig it like such. You could formalize it like this. Here's why this technique is good. Number one, we talked about its ability to apprehend that snag, right? It could prevent that thing from happening. Number two, what you always see on a lot of your jigs conversations is, I like a stand-up jig. I like it to I'll change over to plastics that has the trailer or the craw leg stand up. With this application, sending it in this fashion, when that jig falls to its weighted portion, it will sit off the bottom like this, allowing that tail or whatever appendage you have behind that jig to stand up at a relative angle for attraction, right? Sometimes it might be drawing those bluegill. And what happens is sometimes that jig, depending on what type of plastic you're using, is you'll have a salt impregnated plastic and everything just kind of sinks down, right? And the bluegill will kind of follow it and look at it. But what happens is when you have this at a 45 and it goes down a drop like this, at all times that appendage is sticking up. And now the bluegill are really honed in. And when you have something that's a little bit medium or even a finesse jig of this size, it'll tend to draw some of those bait fish, shellcracker, bluegill, okay, red-breasted sunfish, warmouth. It will bring some of those fish to that, and those fish will draw some of those bigger fish, right? Okay. I've seen this whole conversation unfold many times when I was young. When I was young, I'd spend my elementary, middle school, high school days in the local ponds, specifically in Georgia on some of those military neighborhoods where I grew up in. I would go and spend the whole day on the weekends watching what bass do. Okay. And that whole transition, I knew once the sun was up, way until like 11 o'clock or whatever, they would go and hide up underneath the vegetation. But in the morning, I would see them, they would cruise. And they would always be kind of doing their thing, looking for food, and they would always be able to react to whatever I threw at them. So understanding how to entice them or make an easy meal, one of those ways or methods could be putting that, what I call the mirror rig or whatever you want to call it, the little collar and spring on your jigs and making that thing stand up. And that will make it look like the easy meal. Okay. That's one of those things that make it look like an easy meal. And now you don't have to worry about the whole stand-up jig. The bigger the jig and the more surface area you have, the better you can get it to stand. Okay. I haven't had any issues with it swimming, by the way. So if you think for a second that it's like, oh, well, it's got to be perfect and streamlined and this and that, I'm telling you, I haven't had any issues with it swimming. The other thing is that because they have a tendency, the smaller fish have a tendency to grab this thing. Once they see that the appendage is hanging off the bottom like that, or whatever is exposed, whatever trailer you're using, they see this thing is off the bottom at a 45. Now they have a target. So instead of this going down like this, okay, they'll commit. When they commit to it, they're committing towards the hook point. And I'll catch a lot of small fish on heavier jigs because of this. So even though it has a big hook and it's a big jig, because I've moved my trailer up towards that hook point, I have the ability to hook those fish. Okay, the smaller fish in particular, and get you a couple extra points in the tournament. Okay, and I'm talking about those anywhere from 8 to 12-inch fish. Okay. So the other thing, going back to your jig and pig, nothing wrong with the jig and pig. If you're in a boat, nothing wrong with the jig and pig. But what I found is you'll see that it's pointing. This is my custom jig. It has a tendency to point towards it. But what saves it is that plastic on the side, because I've got that plastic riding high right behind that weed guard, saving that hook point, hence saving your jig. Now, it's important that when we're comparing and contrasting your trailers, that you're using something that's not excessively wide, like a jig and pig, all the time, okay, when you're around especially smaller fish. You'll catch more of your fish and hook more of your fish if you're using a slimmer profile, something that is at least the size and width of the head, but nothing greatly greater than that. You don't want it to be outstandingly wide, because that's creating a gap between the hook point and opportunity if that jig is grabbed sideways. It's creating a gap or a cushion, okay? That's what that's doing. You'll see that if I'm using a soft plastic like a Boss Grub, when that fish hits it, when we're talking about collapsing it from the side, you'll see how nice and easy that is for me to bend that to the side, and it still is an effective hook set. Okay, just like any other trailer or jig. Okay, this bottom piece here, because they'll have a tendency to kind of want to slide, that's what's going to preserve this little extra collar that I put on these on the bottom, especially on the wider gap jigs like this. It prevents that bait from sliding and tearing. You'll go through way more plastics without this. Like say if I did it the traditional way, if I did it traditionally like this, then you're going to have this thing all torn and beat up and everything, right? Especially right here at this section. It'll be all torn and beat up, ripped, and it won't stay on. In this fashion, this will never tear. My experience with this spring like this, it will never tear. What will happen is this collar, when you catch multiple fish, will have a tendency to pull down. So just a little bit of super glue on the collar. But again, if I hand tie these, right? I'm gonna make sure that these are hand tied into the skirt. So a hand tied skirt with the bait keeper tied in there. And then you just put another collar on your hook when you're using a wide one like this, and it's not going anywhere. When it goes down, it's always in that 45 position. They come up behind it and they mollywop it from the back and they get hooked. I'm always making sure the weed guard, again, is abraded. And the last thing that I have to say about this before I go, because I could talk about this for a very long time about all kinds of stuff. But again, this is a conversation that has not been spoken about. I've heard and seen lots of different ideas on this weed guard piece, including putting plastic PVC rings around it, rubber bands around it, separating it, all that good stuff. The last thing that I have to tell you that is going to absolutely change your jig fishing, and it should always be a part of your jig fishing, and all of the gurus, I appreciate them from decades ago that hopefully have watched this, is you should be using some form of fish attractant. And I'm going to explain why it is you should be doing that and specifically how you should be doing that. Number one, let's get the elephant out of the room. It doesn't matter what fish attractant, other than the fact that the fish attractant has some gel or adherence. And number two, that it has amino acids. That is the most important thing that I have to say of the two, is that it has to have amino acids that are the same, okay, or that are authentic to whatever bait they're munching on, or whatever bait that you know they would munch on, whether it be, gosh, there's so many out there. You have obviously like the gulp gel, you have the stink stick, you have the thump gel, you have bait fuel, I can go on and on. You got Procure, there is so many things out there. But the biggest thing is that you have to make sure that it has that greasy, that slightly greasy, slightly oily type texture to it. Amino acids, again, I cannot reiterate that enough, because what happens is this is how bass find their way back to the nest. The bass finds their way back to the nest when you catch them off of their bed, or some angler does. They're able to go back to their bed by the amino acids that are dispersed in the water. Fish will eat based off the amino acids, okay, that they can sense with their smell. When a jig is put in their mouth, in order to ensure that the fish is going to hold on and not just hit it like a nuisance, because there's a lot of that goes on in the spring, the nuisance bite, which is I'm not really hungry, but you're a nuisance. You're around somewhere I don't want you to be around, okay? Or you made me react, okay? So in order for them to hold on to it longer, you want that jig to have that appeal of being real and to have something that's tending to their satiety and taste buds. So my recommendation is just double check to make sure where your product is coming from and how it's made. And as long as it's like, crushed Menhaden or whatever amino acids they're putting in, a lot of guys are swearing up and down by our Berkeley's Max Scent, okay, especially those chunks. Again, there's nothing wrong with the chunks. It's just that the novice angler doesn't realize that when you put the chunk on and then you're not sure about your rod, you're not sure about the reel speed, you're not casting it right while you're still moving forward in the kayak. You don't know anything about your angles. You know nothing about your angles, right? On a jig, you're always following that fish's head. So if that fish is going to the right, you're swinging to the right. Every time you swing up, it's a 50-50. And I don't want to even say it's 50-50, but a lot of times if it's a big fish and you swing up, that's why you miss that fish. Because you peg this head against the fish's mouth and you pulled on the angle of line around the corner of his mouth. All you did was move the fish. You didn't move the jig. So there's a lot going on in the background with jig fishing that you don't realize. When you put a fat trailer on like a trunk, you're just reducing your likelihood because you don't understand how to jig fish yet with proper technique, such as the hook set. Okay. So the Jig and Pig historically has been soaked in bacon grease and all that stuff. And I know you guys know what I'm talking about. So this is why it works, okay? Because it has a sense of appeal. I remember when I was young, I was catching bass on little chunks of hot dog while I was catfishing. Right? Them bass will still hit that. Here's the other thing. When you put an attractant on specifically on your jig, okay, you want your jig to be a little, what I call, lubricated. Except for one place and one place only. It draws me back to the original conversation almost an hour ago. This is a sacred area. This weed guard is a sacred area. Okay, this weed guard stays dry. This weed guard stays abraded, and this weed guard stays thinned out like this, nice and thin, nice and dispersed, especially on a heavier jig. Right? A heavier jig is going to have a heavier weed guard fiber. If you keep your weed guard fibers together and you have an extremely sharp point, just like I mentioned earlier, that sharp point will get crowded into your weed guard. You could cut it. That's fine. You could cut it. But I prefer to just keep it very dispersed. Very dispersed. That's it. Okay? And you want it abraded. You want to take that sandpaper and you want to abrade it and make it feel real nice and rough, specifically on that first half inch. If there was one place on this thing, the first half inch of every weed guard should be abraded so that it drags and catches along the grit of that fish. Back to scent. Amino acids and some type of gel. Doesn't have to be oily per se. Doesn't have to be like a fish oil, but it needs to be a gel that sticks and stays along that skirt. When it comes to your skirts, it could be fat. It could be whatever you want it to be because you want to dictate how fast it falls, the buoyancy, anything and everything. It's all your world. But what I've learned is that you do not want any skirt that has abrasive strands, meaning the abrasions come in mostly from the glitter or the material. The reason being is because when you have a big fish, okay, even the head needs to have some of your juice on it, okay? When you have a big fish, and you're going to run into this, promise you, sometime in the next year, you got a big fish. You go back and look at any Tourney X pictures. A big 22 plus inch fish The tip of his mouth from the angle of his jaw, and if you were to open up his mouth, I guarantee you would probably be anywhere from 5 to 6 inches or greater. I would even argue 6 inches or greater. A 3/4 ounce jig, and if you're throwing a common half to or a 3/8 or even a finesse jig, let's just say you're throwing a finesse jig, little 3/16 something, 1/4 ounce. It's nothing for that fish when he sucks this thing in for him to get it back of his throat like this. And his tip of his mouth is right here. You go to pull it and you open his mouth and you find that it's 4 inches or more in his throat. This happened last week. And then he swims off with it. The big ones, the big ones, they just and hold on to it and then they just cruise. They gone. Like it was nothing. Them small ones, they'll sit there and try to like crunch it. And this brings me all back to the conversation about why a jig works in certain conditions and in certain sizes, right? The small one realizes, damn, I just ate a big fish or I just ate a big meal. It's going to kick and scream. I got to freaking crunch it and thrash and crunch it and crunch it because I'm inexperienced about big meals. I just know it's going to kick and scream, right? Big one, he's got practice in this field. A big one, a big 8-pounder, he's got practice in this field. This right here ain't nothing. He knows that he don't got to worry about any kicking or screaming. So he swallows this thing and gets down there halfway down his mouth and he's gone. This happens on every big fish. Damn near every big fish. Unless they're sitting there crunching it, it's in the morning time. Sometimes they'll be a little feisty. And if you feel that little tick on the line, they could be just trying to crunch on it. And that's in the morning time. But oftentimes when it's an easy meal and the big fish whacks it and it's just an easy peasy meal, them fish will just go and hold on to it like nothing happened. And that's how you know that fish believed it was an easy meal, right? Either reaction, easy, or a nuisance. Okay? A nuisance fish, you'll feel that fish tap on it because he's trying to crush it, right? A nuisance bite. Okay. Again, he ate it because he was comfortable, right? He was secure. And he had some level of satiety that required some input. The problem with with keeping it dry, the problem with not putting on a gel is because when you have a big enough fish or you have an average fish that's at the wrong angle, and you're not, again, attuned to your rod setup, attuned to your reel setup, attuned to your actual geospatial position relative to the fish. You're not, basically, in a nutshell, umbrella term, you're not attuned to your situation, your angle. And that fish is, for some reason, going away from you. Another one is you put it into a tree, and instead of coming out of the tree, the fish goes into the tree, away from you. That's another one. What happens is you have a tendency, or there's another one. You're not paying attention to what technique you should be using. So you're fishing really deep water, but you're fishing deep water that's below you, and your angle is down below. So that means you're pitching and flipping in bluffs or deep water, meaning 10 plus feet deep, and it's direct. I would even say 12 foot, really, 12 foot down deep, and it's within that maybe 5 to 15 feet range away from you, and you're fishing down there at 12, so your angle is down, okay? Your rod tip and your line, okay, your rod tip's out, but your line is straight down, and you go to pull up on the fish, and it's a big enough fish. The reason why you don't want a dry skirt, okay, even if it's just right out of the box, is because you go to pull on that big fish, and he's got it down, he or she, probably a she, and your line is here at the tip of his mouth. This is where your line's at. And it's going this way, away from you. You go to pull on that, and you have to pull. This angle will start to get tense. That will pull that fish, and this will slide like this. So this thing actually has to slide. Now, imagine if you did not use some type of lubricant on this thing. you didn't put a fish attractant, and this fish feels this tug, some of those fish will try to have a tendency to bite down a little bit harder. Great video for you to watch would be Greg Hackney talk about this. Greg Hackney is one of the ones that believes you can allow the fish to run with it. Other guys believe that's a no-no, Gerald Swindle being one of them. Second, you feel that you need to put the mollywop on him. Same thing with Roland Martin. Roland Martin feels the same way. You don't let them run with it. So if you are in a situation where that angle is going away from you because the fish is, and you go to pull, this thing is up under the roof of that mouth just dragging along. It's dragging along, and it may not collapse on that hook point. It may just pull. It may just pull. It may turn and pull like this. I don't know if you can see it, but it has no reason for the hook point to snag here. It has every reason for this thing to pull up and get the hook away from the mouth. If the mouth is big and that fish feels it and he starts opening, what happens is the pressure is on the head, not the point. So it's not like it's going to drag perfectly across the top of that mouth like this and then hook. The pressure is on this line, and so it will start pulling like this. And that weed guard will ride that fish's mouth. And this is why sometimes then when it finally gets over that angle right outside the mouth, then you get the fish on that corner of the mouth. Now, how many times have you looked and seen on all these videos that these guys have that jig all around the corner of that mouth? You see, so if you study the science of what's actually going on here, is you have it riding along the weed guard. You have a thick trailer that's creating a buffer, okay? It's creating a buffer, essentially, especially on a jig and pig, and he's going away from you, and you have a wide trailer, it's creating a buffer. And then it finally comes out, and if the buffer is still too big, what happens? It rides that buffer out into the mouth. And you say, oh man, he spit it. He didn't spit it. You wasn't at the right angle, is what it was. Right? He wasn't at the right angle, and it was enough kicking and screaming. Imagine trying to swallow a turtle. It was enough kicking and screaming that the fish just wanted to spit it out because he felt too much of the pressure. Okay? To fix that, you want to have this thing with some type of fish attractant to maintain the fish's trust, if you will, in that he's got a meal. But two is you want that jig to move. And this is on top of abrading that weed guard. This is the reason why you're going to have that lubricant on your skirt at all times, whatever it may be, bait fuel, gel, whatever it may be. You want it on the head and you want it on the skirt. Why is that? Because if I'm underpowered in any circumstance, whether it be I didn't pay attention to the rod I chose, whether I didn't pay attention to the angle in which the fish was running, whether I didn't pay attention to my IPT and my inches per turn, whatever it may be, okay, you want to make sure that you're lubricating that skirt. Make sure that that skirt moves. That's the purpose. So you have just the slightest chance of hooking that fish. For some odd reason, he runs at that wrong angle. Now you have a fighting chance to get that fish. This is why you put your stuff on your skirts. You leave your weed guard and that abraded section dry without any of that product. Okay? So that you have the chance. And you keep your trailers relatively narrow. Okay? Grubs, twin tail grubs, even speed craws, anything that's relatively slim. The second you start getting real wide, doing your like beaver style, your D-bombs, your anything, there's so many out there, but anything that's really wide is going to put you at a disadvantage and create a buffer between the fish's tissue surface and that hook point. And if you're using this technique, again, be cognizant on not to put your product too high on that hook point, okay? Unless you're just going to go ahead and Texas rig it. Then I would just say Texas rig it. But don't go and put it like that, okay? Put it somewhere right in there. This is going to help keep that hook point away from cover, save you more jig, save you money, and keep that plastic pegged on your jig so you're not going through all your plastics, and it's conservation friendly. Okay, so that's that. The setup: large, extra large, bait clip, collar. Now I'm going to give you a bonus clip and tell you that once you figure out how to do this with your jigs, all of a sudden you got slobber knockers that you be throwing all day because you won't be switching out any of your plastic, because now you got the same setup on your spinner bait, you got the same setup on your bladed jig. Look at that. And you got that on the back there. Again, making sure that you keep your little collar on the back too. Keeps it there in the 45. There you go. So now you can swim with it and those fish won't tear it and move it around. Put it on your spinner bait, put it on your bladed jig. Recap: double pincer, double pincing. Tune your hook. Bait keeper, collar, on all jigs you can think of, any jig you can think of. Turns it into a great shaky head, turns it into a Texas rig, turns it into quality plastic conservation control for all fishermen, turns it into a 45 presentation, okay? Keeps it off the structure, keeps you snag free, keeps you on the water, keeps you casting longer. The JIG, I hope you guys appreciate the idea. Plenty of people say no, plenty of people say cool, but it's what I've been working with, and it's helped me preserve a lot of my plastics and get more fish in the boat. Make sure that you're using some form of fish attractant, even on other things. It's important that you get that fish attractant on there and have them fish hold on a little bit. My take is, after witnessing all of my jig fishing experiences, I don't fish a lot of topwater like I should. I don't fish a lot of anything. I'm more of a critical thinker. I like to get onto a particular technique and I want to know every single thing about it. And this is what I came up with after I learned everything about the jig. Appreciate y'all tuning in. Hope to see y'all in the water. Happy holidays. See you next time.